Warsaw, 1942. If you had walked through its streets that autumn, you would have thought you were walking through the skeleton of a city. The buildings stood like broken teeth against a gray sky. Smoke rose from distant fires, curling lazily upward as if the city itself was exhaling its last breath. The sound of boots, always boots, echoed off the cobblestones. German patrols marched in perfect formation, their faces hard, their eyes scanning for any sign of defiance. This was a city crushed under the weight of occupation, where laughter once filled the cafes and children played in the parks. Now there was only silence punctuated by fear. The Nazis had come with a clear mission: to erase Polish culture, to extinguish Polish identity, to turn Warsaw into nothing more than a labor camp for the Reich. They closed the schools first. It was one of their earliest decrees. All universities, all high schools, all places of learning shuttered, locked, forbidden. Education, they believed, was dangerous. And educated people could think, could resist, could remember who they were. And so, they took it away. Polish teachers were arrested. Books were burned in massive pyres in the city squares, the flames licking hungrily at poetry, at history, at mathematics. The occupiers wanted to create a generation of workers, not thinkers. A generation that would forget they had ever been anything more than servants. But here is what the Nazis did not understand about the Polish people. You cannot kill hope by simply declaring it illegal. In the rubble of that broken city, in the shadow of the occupation, something remarkable was happening. In basements, in attics, in rooms hidden behind false walls, teachers gathered their students in secret. They called it the Tagen Completi, the secret teaching. It was an underground education system, an entire parallel world of learning that existed in whispers and hidden textbooks. Thousands of teachers risked their lives. Thousands of students risked theirs too. If you were caught attending these illegal classes, the punishment was immediate: execution for the teacher, deportation to a concentration camp for the students. There was no trial, no second chance, just a bullet or a train to the camps. And yet, they came. They came because they understood that a people without education is a people without a future. They came because learning was not just about passing exams. It was an act of resistance, a declaration that they were still human, still Polish, still alive in every way that mattered. One of these secret schools operated in a small apartment in the Mokotów district. It was unassuming, easy to miss. Just another gray building among hundreds of gray buildings. But inside, in a cramped room barely large enough for a table and a few chairs, 7 children gathered. Room 12, they called it. Not because it was the 12th room in the building, but because 12 was the number written on a scrap of paper that served as their attendance list. 7 children, all different ages, all from different families, all bound together by a shared determination to learn. Their teacher was a woman named Mrs. Kowalska. Not her real name, of course. In those days, everyone had at least 2 names, the one on their false papers and the one they whispered only to those they trusted. She had been a university professor before the war, a scholar of literature and history. Now she was a ghost, moving through the city with a worn leather satchel full of contraband, books, pencils, paper. Every lesson was a risk. Every page turned was an act of defiance. The children would arrive separately, at different times, slipping through back alleys and side doors. They never entered the building the same way twice. They learned to move like shadows, to recognize the sound of German voices from 3 blocks away, to memorize the patrol schedules. Inside room 12, the world was different. For a few hours each day, the war seemed to fade. There was mathematics and grammar, history and poetry. Mrs. Kowalska taught them about Copernicus, about Marie Curie, about the Polish kings and queens who had once ruled a proud nation. She taught them that knowledge was a kind of freedom that no occupier could take away. But freedom, even the freedom of the mind, came with a price. And in the autumn of 1942, that price was about to come due. Because someone had been watching. Someone had been listening. And the Gestapo were very, very good at their job. Her real name was Zofia Nowak, though by 1942, names had become as fluid as water in occupied Warsaw. On her forged identification papers, she was Helena Wisniewska, a seamstress. To the neighbors who knew better than to ask questions, she was simply the quiet woman in apartment 4. But to 7 children who climbed the narrow stairs to room 12, she was still Miss Sophia, and that name carried more weight than any false document ever could. Before the war, Zofia had been a teacher at one of Warsaw's finest schools. She had taught literature and history to rooms full of eager students, their faces bright with possibility. She remembered standing before a classroom of 30 children, sunlight streaming through tall windows, the smell of chalk dust and old books filling the air. She remembered reading them poetry, Mikovic, Slovakia, and watching their eyes light up with understanding. That world was gone now, erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. When the Germans closed the schools, Zofia had a choice to make. She could disappear into the anonymous mass of the occupied, keeping her head down, surviving day by day. Many did exactly that, and no one could blame them. Survival itself was an act of courage in those days. But Zofia couldn't do it. She couldn't watch an entire generation grow up in darkness, their minds left fallow and empty. She had been a teacher for 15 years. It wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. And so, when whispers of the Tajin Completi began to circulate through trusted networks, she didn't hesitate. She joined the underground education system. It wasn't organized in any traditional sense. There were no offices, no official rosters, no salaries. Just teachers finding students and students finding teachers, passing information through coded messages and trusted intermediaries. A note slipped into a coat pocket. A whispered conversation in a bread line. A knock on a door at twilight. Zofia found her 7 children that way. One by one, they came to her, or rather, their parents brought them. These mothers and fathers who understood that feeding a child's mind was just as important as feeding their body. Perhaps more important, because hunger of the mind could destroy a people even more completely than hunger of the stomach. There was Jakub, 12 years old, brilliant at mathematics, his fingers constantly working through equations even when there was no paper to write on. There was Anna, 10, who devoured every book Zofia could smuggle to her, reading by candlelight until her eyes ached. There was Pyotr, the youngest at 8, who struggled with reading but had a memory like a steel trap. He could recite entire passages of poetry after hearing them just once. And there were 4 others, each with their own gifts, their own hunger for knowledge, their own stubborn refusal to let the occupation steal their future. Room 12 became their sanctuary. It was a small space, barely 4 meters across, with walls that had once been white but were now stained with damp and age. A single window looked out onto a courtyard, its glass covered with a dark cloth to hide the candlelight within. There was a table, scarred and wobbly, and a collection of mismatched chairs salvaged from abandoned apartments. The children sat shoulder to shoulder, their notebooks, precious, irreplaceable, spread before them. Zofia taught them everything she could. Polish language and literature, of course, that was the heart of it, the preservation of their cultural soul. But also mathematics, because logic was a form of freedom. History, because a people without memory is a people without identity. Even a little science, though laboratory equipment was impossible to come by. She made do with thought experiments, with diagrams drawn in the margins of old newspapers. Every lesson was prepared by candlelight in the hours before dawn. Zofia would sit at her own tiny table, her hands cramped from cold, writing out lesson plans on whatever paper she could find. Sometimes it was the backs of German propaganda leaflets. There was a certain satisfaction in using Nazi lies as the foundation for Polish truth. Sometimes it was pages torn carefully from books, leaving the rest intact for another day. She hid her materials with obsessive care. Textbooks were concealed inside hollowed-out furniture. Notebooks were kept in a false bottom of a kitchen drawer. If the Gestapo came, she would have perhaps 30 seconds to destroy evidence. She'd practiced it in her mind 100 times. Grab the documents, throw them in the stove, make sure the fire caught. 30 seconds between life and death. The teaching itself was done in whispers. Even though the apartment was carefully chosen, far enough from the stairwell, with neighbors who could be trusted, Zofia never raised her voice above a murmur. The children learned to do the same. They entered silently, greeted each other with nods rather than words, and kept their pencils from scratching too loudly on paper. It was an education conducted in the grammar of fear, yet somehow, in that small room, fear transformed into something else. Into defiance. Into hope. Into the radical belief that the human spirit could not be conquered by boots and guns and barbed wire. Zofia watched her students' faces as they learned, and she saw something the Nazis would never understand. She saw freedom. Not the freedom to walk the streets without fear, that was long gone, but the freedom of the mind, the freedom to think and question and imagine. That freedom, she knew, was eternal. It could not be occupied. And so every day, despite the danger, despite the exhaustion, despite the gnawing fear that tomorrow might be the day they were discovered, Zofia Nowak climbed the stairs to room 12, sat down with her 7 children, and taught. Because some acts of resistance don't require weapons. Sometimes, all you need is a book, a candle, and the unshakable belief that knowledge is the one thing no army can ever truly destroy. They came to her through the cracks in the broken city, through whispers passed in darkened doorways, through the desperate hope of parents who understood that their children's minds were worth risking everything to save. The first was Jakub. His mother found Zofia in a bread queue one frozen morning in early spring. The woman said nothing at first, just stood behind her in line, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Then, as the line shuffled forward, she leaned in and whispered a single word. "Teacher." Zofia's heart stopped. In that instant, 1,000 possibilities flashed through her mind. Was this a trap? An informant? The Gestapo used Polish collaborators, people desperate enough or broken enough to betray their neighbors for an extra ration card or a promise of safety. But when Zofia turned and looked into the woman's eyes, she saw only a mother's fierce, aching love. "My son," the woman whispered. "He's 12. He forgets nothing. Before the war, his teachers said he could be an engineer, a scientist. Now he sits in our apartment and counts cracks in the ceiling because there's nothing else for his mind to do. Please, if you can teach him anything, anything at all, I'll give you whatever I have." Zofia told her to come to a specific address 3 days later at twilight. Not her own address, never that. A neutral location, an abandoned shop where they could talk without being overheard. And there, in the gathering darkness, Jakub's mother brought her son. He was tall for his age, all sharp angles and nervous energy, his eyes darting around the empty room as if cataloging every detail. Zofia asked him a simple mathematics problem, something about the ratio of apples to oranges, absurdly normal for such abnormal times. He solved it in seconds, then looked at her and said, "But miss, what if the apples are different sizes?" She knew then that she would teach him, that she had to. The second child was Anna. She came through a network of trusted contacts, a former colleague who knew someone whose cousin was hiding a little girl with false papers. Anna's real parents had been taken months earlier. No one knew where. She lived now with an elderly aunt who could barely feed herself, let alone provide an education. When Zofia met Anna for the first time, the girl was clutching a book so worn that its cover had fallen off entirely. It was a collection of fairy tales, the pages yellowed and fragile. "I've read it 17 times, Anna said quietly. "I don't have anything else." Zofia felt something crack inside her chest. She reached into her bag and pulled out another book, a slim volume of Polish poetry she'd been saving for herself. 18 will have to wait, she said, handing the girl the new book. "You have homework now." Anna's eyes filled with tears. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. One by one they came. Pyotr, the youngest, brought by his grandmother who had sewn documents into the lining of her coat. Hannah, smuggled from the countryside when her village became too dangerous. Stefan, whose father had been a professor and who carried that legacy like a weight on his small shoulders. Tomasz and Christina, siblings who refused to be separated, who arrived together and sat together and whispered encouragement to each other when the lessons grew difficult. 7 children. 7 different stories of survival and loss. 7 sets of parents or grandparents or aunts who made the terrifying decision to send their children into the underground, to trust a teacher they barely knew with their most precious treasures. Getting them to room 12 was its own kind of choreography. They never arrived together. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, they came at staggered intervals, slipping through the city like ghosts. Jakub knew to approach from the east, through a gap in a bombed-out building that led to a courtyard behind the apartment. Anna came from the west, cutting through an alley where the German patrols rarely ventured because the cobblestones were too uneven for their motorcycles. The others had their own routes, their own patterns, memorized down to the number of steps and the placement of each turn. They learned to recognize danger from a block away. The sound of heavy boots, German, not Polish. The idling engine of a military vehicle. The particular silence that fell over a street when the Gestapo were searching nearby, a silence made of held breath and frozen fear. If they sensed danger, they scattered. They'd been taught to never lead trouble back to room 12. Better to miss a lesson, Zofia had told them, than to risk everyone. Better to turn away and try again another day. The children became experts at invisibility. They wore drab, forgettable clothing. They kept their eyes down. They never ran. Running attracted attention. But they learned to walk with purpose, as if they had every right to be wherever they were. As if they were just another child on an errand for their mother, fetching water or queuing for rations. And in their pockets or hidden in their sleeves, they carried their most dangerous contraband. Pencils, scraps of paper, sometimes a small book. These were the tools of their resistance, more subversive than any weapon because they represented the one thing the occupation could not tolerate: the refusal to forget, the determination to remain educated, to remain Polish, to remain human. Inside room 12, once the last child had arrived and Zofia had checked the street one final time, they could finally breathe. The heavy cloth would be pulled across the window. The single candle would be lit, its flame casting long shadows on the walls. And the children would take their places at the scarred wooden table, shoulder to shoulder, their faces solemn with the weight of what they were doing. Sometimes, before the lesson began, Zofia would look at them. These 7 brave souls, none older than 13, all of them carrying losses no child should have to bear, and she would feel a surge of pride so fierce it was almost painful. They were not just students. They were not just children surviving a war. They were the keepers of the flame, the guardians of a future that the Nazis insisted did not exist. They were proof that you could occupy a city, you could burn its books, you could close its schools, but you could not kill the hunger to learn. Every day they gathered in that small room, they were making a choice to believe that tomorrow would come, that Poland would endure. That knowledge mattered more than fear. And every day they made that choice, they won a small victory that no army could ever take away from them. The Gestapo had their guns and their laws and their endless lists of prohibitions. But in room 12, 7 children had something more powerful. They had books, they had a teacher, and they had the unshakable conviction that learning was an act of rebellion no occupation could ever crush. Inside room 12, time moved differently. Outside, the city was measured in patrols and curfews, in ration cards and the thunder of distant artillery. But within those 4 walls, time was measured in lessons and whispered discoveries, in the slow turning of pages and the scratch of pencil on precious paper. Every session began the same way. Zofia would wait until all 7 children had arrived, until she'd heard the soft triple knock that meant the last one was safely inside. Then she would bolt the door, not with a loud clang that might draw attention, but with a careful, practiced silence. She'd pull the heavy cloth across the window, blocking out what little daylight filtered into the courtyard. And finally, she would light the single candle. That moment, the flare of the match, the small golden flame catching and growing. That was when the transformation happened. When room 12 stopped being a hiding place and became a school again. When 7 frightened children stopped being survivors and became students. "Good morning," Zofia would whisper, and 7 voices would whisper back in unison. "Good morning, Miss Zofia." It was such a small thing, that greeting. Such an ordinary ritual from the before times. But in its ordinariness lay its power. It was a declaration that normal things still existed, that civilization hadn't been entirely crushed under the boots of the occupation. The lessons themselves were a patchwork of whatever Zofia could salvage or remember. She had managed to hide a few precious textbooks, a mathematics primer, a volume of Polish literature, a battered atlas with half its pages missing. But mostly, she taught from memory, reconstructing entire lessons from her years in the classroom before the war. Mathematics came first, always. Zofia believed in starting with something concrete, something that had clear answers in a world where nothing else did. Jakub would practically vibrate with excitement during these lessons, his hand shooting up before Zofia had even finished writing the problem on their makeshift chalkboard, a piece of dark fabric stretched across a wooden frame, marked with precious chalk smuggled from God knew where. If a train travels at 60 kilometers per hour, Zofia would whisper, and another train leaves from the opposite direction at 80 kilometers per hour, when will they meet? In the old world, this had been just an exercise. In the new world, it carried unintended weight. Trains meant deportations now. Trains meant the camps everyone whispered about, but no one fully understood. For a moment, the children would freeze, and Zofia would hate herself for the careless metaphor. But then Jakub would lean forward, his pencil already moving across paper, and he'd whisper excitedly, "It depends on the distance between the starting points, Miss Sophia. You need to give us that variable." And just like that, they'd be students again. Just students solving a problem. Nothing more. Literature was where they truly came alive, though. Zofia would recite poetry from memory. Mikovich's Pan Today Ausch, Slowaki's romantic verses, fragments of Norwood that she'd committed to heart decades ago. The children would listen with an intensity that nearly broke her heart, their young faces solemn in the candlelight, drinking in words that connected them to a Poland that still existed in language even if it seemed to be vanishing from the map. Sometimes, she'd have them memorize verses, not just as an exercise, but as an act of preservation. If they burn every book, she told them once, if they destroy every library and every school, we will carry Poland in our minds. We will be living libraries. Anna was the best at this. She could hear a stanza once and recite it back perfectly, her soft voice giving weight to every syllable. The others would watch her with something like awe, this small girl with haunted eyes who could summon beauty out of memory. History was the most dangerous subject, and therefore perhaps the most important. Zofia taught them about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, about King Jan III Sobieski who had saved Vienna, about the Constitution of 1791, one of the first in Europe. She'd remind them with quiet pride. She taught them about Poland's centuries of existence, its culture, and its contributions to the world. The Nazis wanted Polish children to grow up thinking they had no history worth remembering, no culture worth preserving. Every lesson in Room 12 was a direct refutation of that lie. They had one atlas, ancient, incomplete, but precious beyond measure. The children would gather around it during geography lessons, their fingers tracing borders that no longer existed, cities that had been renamed or destroyed. Zofia would point to Warsaw and tell them what it had been, a city of libraries and theaters, of universities and concert halls. A city of light. Remember this, she'd tell them. Remember what it was. Because someday, we'll build it again. In between the formal lessons, there were small moments of grace. Pyotr, the youngest, struggled with reading, the letters swimming before his eyes in a way that frustrated him to tears. So Hannah, only a year older but infinitely patient, would sit beside him during breaks and trace letters on his palm with her finger. "Feel the shape," she'd whisper. "The letter P is like a door that only opens one way." Stefan and Tomasz would occasionally argue about mathematics problems, their whispered debates growing almost heated before Zofia would have to shush them with a gentle hand on each boy's shoulder. But she loved those arguments. They meant the children were engaged, thinking critically, not just memorizing by rote. Christina, the oldest girl at 13, kept a secret notebook where she wrote poetry of her own. Once, she showed a piece to Zofia, verses about a bird in a cage who sang anyway, whose song could not be silenced no matter how small the cage became. Zofia had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by the girl's raw talent and the tragedy that she might never have the chance to truly develop it. During their short breaks, they could risk an hour and a half at most before the children needed to scatter again. They would sometimes play quiet games, silent charades, where they'd act out historical figures or literary characters. Mental arithmetic competitions that Jakub almost always won. Word games where they'd take turns creating sentences using increasingly obscure vocabulary, stretching the limits of their language skills. These weren't just games. They were normalcy. They were childhood, stolen back one whispered laugh at a time. Zofia watched them during these moments, really watched them. She saw how Anna's shoulders would relax when she was deep in a story, how Jakub's nervous energy would transform into focused intensity during a mathematics challenge, how Pyotr's face would light up when he successfully read an entire sentence without help, how the others would exchange small smiles, tiny conspiracies of joy that the occupation hadn't yet crushed. In those moments, Room 12 was more than a hiding place. It was a sanctuary, a small pocket of resistance where the simple act of learning became revolutionary, where children could be children for just a little while, even if they had to do it in whispers by candlelight. The world outside could be burning. The Gestapo could be hunting. The future could be uncertain and terrifying. But for an hour and a half each day, 7 children sat at a scarred wooden table and learned about mathematics and poetry, about history and geography, about the world as it had been and as it might be again. And in learning, they became more than victims. They became keepers of the flame. They became hope itself, small and flickering perhaps, but impossible to extinguish. When the lesson ended and it was time to leave, they would gather their few belongings, their scraps of paper, their precious pencils, and prepare to become invisible again. But before they left, before they slipped back into the occupied city, Zofia would touch each child's head gently, a blessing without words. And every single one of them would straighten their shoulders just a little, would lift their chins just slightly. Because for that brief time in room 12, they had remembered what it felt like to be more than just survivors. They had remembered what it felt like to be students, to be Polish, to be free. It happened on a Tuesday in late October. The children were deep in a geography lesson, their heads bent over the tattered atlas when they heard it. The sound that every person in occupied Warsaw had learned to recognize with a primal, immediate dread. Boots. Heavy. Military. German. Not distant, not on another street. Close. In the building. Zofia's hand shot up, finger pressed to her lips. The universal signal they'd practiced 100 times but prayed they'd never need. 7 children froze instantly, absolutely. Anna's pencil stopped mid-stroke. Jakub's mouth closed on a half-formed question. Even little Pyotr, who sometimes fidgeted without meaning to, became perfectly, unnaturally still. The footsteps were on the stairs now. Climbing. The building had 4 floors, and room 12 was on the 3rd. Each footfall was distinct, deliberate, the sound of authority that didn't need to hurry because it knew no one would dare to run. Zofia's mind raced through the protocol they'd rehearsed. The textbooks were already hidden in the false bottom drawer. The chalk and the makeshift board could be broken down in seconds, transformed back into ordinary fabric and scattered pieces. The children's notebooks were small enough to tuck into their clothing if they had time. But there were 7 children around a table in a room that was supposed to be empty. There was no hiding that. No explaining that. The boots reached the 3rd floor landing. Stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps had been. In that silence, Zofia could hear everything. The hammering of her own heart, the shallow breathing of 7 children trying desperately not to breathe at all, the distant sound of a cart rattling over cobblestones somewhere outside, impossibly far away and normal and unreachable. She could see the fear in their eyes. Not panic. She'd trained them better than that. But the clear, cold understanding that this might be the moment. This might be when their fragile world of whispered lessons and candlelight ended in gunfire or worse. Christina's hand found her brother Tomasz's under the table. Their fingers intertwined, knuckles white. Hannah closed her eyes and her lips moved silently. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps just the recitation of a poem, something to hold on to in case there was nothing else left to hold. The door handle rattled. Not their door. The apartment next to theirs. Number 11. Zofia heard voices then, muffled through the wall. German, sharp and demanding. Then Polish, an older man's voice, trembling, apologetic. Papers, yes, of course. Right here, sir, everything is in order. The interrogation lasted an eternity. In reality, it was probably less than 5 minutes. But time had stopped meaning anything in room 12. Every second stretched like taffy, thick and suffocating. The children remained frozen, living statues arranged around the table. Zofia couldn't even signal to them to move, to breathe, to do anything. Any motion at all might cause a floorboard to creak, might draw attention to the room that was supposed to be unoccupied. She thought about the man next door, Mr. Kowalczyk, a retired clerk who lived alone and kept to himself. She'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in all the months she'd been using this apartment. But in this moment, his ability to satisfy the German soldiers was the only thing standing between her children and discovery. She heard papers rustling, the harsh bark of German questions, Mr. Kowalczyk's increasingly desperate assurances that everything was legitimate, that he had permission to be there, that he was registered, that he had nothing to hide. And then, footsteps again. Heavy boots moving away from number 11. Moving toward. No, they were heading back to the stairs. Back down. But they didn't descend. They stopped. One of the soldiers said something, and another laughed, a sound like breaking glass, casual cruelty without even needing a target. They were discussing something. Perhaps deciding whether to search more apartments. Perhaps drawing lots to see who had to climb to the 4th floor. Zofia's eyes moved to the candle. Its flame was steady, but the wax was burning down. How long had they been frozen like this? 10 minutes? 15? The candle would last another half hour at most, and then it would gutter out. And in the darkness, she'd have no way to see the children's faces, no way to guide them if they needed to evacuate quickly. Anna's breath was coming too fast now. Zofia could see the girl's chest rising and falling rapidly, the beginning of panic, of hyperventilation. Carefully, so slowly it was barely movement at all, Zofia caught Anna's eye and took a deep, deliberate breath herself. Hold. Release. Another breath. Hold. Release. Showing the girl how to control it, how to master the fear before it mastered her. Anna's breathing slowed. Just slightly, but it was enough. Outside the door, the soldiers were still talking. One of them said something about Polnisch Schwein, Polish pigs, and they both laughed again. The casual dehumanization was almost worse than the threat of violence. It reminded Zofia that to these men, she and her students weren't people. They were problems to be solved, vermin to be exterminated, obstacles in the way of the glorious Reich. More footsteps. But these were different, lighter, hurried. A woman's voice, speaking German with a Polish accent, breathless with the strain of forced deference. Officers, excuse me, officers, I saw someone suspicious in the courtyard. I thought you should know. It was Mrs. Wojcik from the 2nd floor. A collaborator? Or someone trying to draw the Germans away from this floor? Protecting neighbors she'd never spoken to through a desperate act of misdirection? The soldier's tone changed, became alert, interested. Questions fired at Mrs. Wojcik. Which courtyard? What did the suspicious person look like? How long ago? And then, blessed, miraculous, the boots began to descend. Rapidly now, taking the stairs 2 at a time, the soldiers energized by the promise of a real chase rather than the tedious business of checking papers in dingy apartments. Still, Zofia didn't move, didn't signal the children to relax. Not yet. Not until she heard the building's main door slam shut. Not until she heard the sound of boots fading down the street. Not until a full minute of silence had passed. Then too. Only then did she lower her hand. Only then did she whisper, so quietly it was barely audible. Breathe. 7 children gasped as if they'd been underwater. Pyotr started to cry, silent tears streaming down his face. Hannah wrapped her arms around him, rocking him gently. Jakub's hands were shaking so badly he had to press them flat on the table to make them stop. Stefan stared at nothing, his eyes wide and glassy with shock. Zofia wanted to comfort them, wanted to gather them all into her arms and tell them it was over, they were safe. But she couldn't promise that, because it wasn't over, and they weren't safe. They would never be safe as long as the occupation continued. This was their reality. Every lesson conducted on the knife's edge of discovery. Every moment of learning shadowed by the possibility of death. Pack up, she whispered finally. Quietly. Carefully. We're finished for today. The children moved mechanically, their hands still trembling as they tucked away their notebooks and pencils. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They'd been lucky. This time, they'd been lucky. And everyone in that room understood that luck was a finite resource in occupied Warsaw. As the children prepared to leave, Zofia checked the street from behind the curtain. The soldiers were gone, vanished into the gray afternoon to chase Mrs. Wojcik's phantom suspicious person. Or perhaps to harass someone else, somewhere else. It didn't matter. For now, this moment, the path was clear. They left as they always did, one at a time, at careful intervals, disappearing into the wounded city like drops of water into the sea. But today, there was no lightness in their steps, no sense of victory at having learned something new. Today, they left carrying the weight of how close they'd come, how fragile their small resistance truly was. Zofia was the last to leave, as always. She extinguished the candle, hid the materials, and stood for a moment in the darkness of room 12. Her hands were shaking now, delayed shock finally catching up with her now that the children were gone, and she could allow herself to feel it. They'd survive today, but there would be another Tuesday, another patrol, another moment of holding their breath and praying that 7 heartbeats couldn't be heard through walls. This was the price of resistance, not paid in grand gestures or heroic battles, but in moments like these, moments of pure, distilled terror where the only weapon was silence and the only shield was luck. And still, she knew she would come back tomorrow. The children would come back tomorrow. Because what other choice was there? To surrender to ignorance? To let the occupation win not just the streets but the minds of an entire generation? No, they would come back. They would light the candle again. They would whisper their lessons. They would hold their breath when the boots came close. And they would teach. And they would learn. Because in the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered. It happened 3 weeks later, on a night when the November wind howled through Warsaw's broken streets like a wounded animal. They had been careless. Not intentionally. Zofia would replay it in her mind 1,000 times afterward, searching for the exact moment when they'd made a mistake. Perhaps it was staying 10 minutes longer than usual because Pyotr had finally managed to read an entire page without help, and the joy on his face had been too precious to cut short. Perhaps it was the way Anna had actually laughed, at one of Jakub's terrible mathematical puns, and the sound had been louder than it should have been. Or perhaps there had been no mistake at all. Perhaps someone had simply been watching, waiting, counting the children who came and went from a building that was supposed to house only registered residents with proper papers. The knock on the door was not gentle. 3 heavy blows that shook the frame, followed by a voice in German. Aufmachen. Gestapo. Open immediately. Time fractured. In that instant, Zofia lived a dozen different futures simultaneously. She saw the children dragged into the street, saw herself against a wall, blindfolded, saw 7 families learning that their children would never come home, saw the end of room 12, the end of everything. The children looked at her with eyes that held no hope, only a terrible, ancient acceptance. They were so young, but the occupation had aged them in ways that had nothing to do with years. They knew what happened to people caught breaking Nazi laws. They'd all seen the bodies left hanging in the public squares as warnings. Hide. Zofia mouthed silently, but there was nowhere to hide. The room was too small, too bare. The false bottom drawer could conceal books, but not children. The space under the table was laughably insufficient. 7 children could not simply disappear. Another hammering on the door. Open now, or we break it down. Zofia's mind became very clear, very calm. It was strange. She'd expected panic, but instead there was only a kind of crystalline focus. A decision tree with exactly 2 branches, and both led to terrible places. But one branch might save the children, and that was the only calculation that mattered. She moved to the door, her hand on the bolt. But before she opened it, she turned back to the children one last time. They were pressed against the far wall, Christina's arms around Pyotr, Jakub standing in front of Anna, as if his 12-year-old body could somehow shield her. Siblings, not by blood, but by something deeper, forged in whispered lessons and shared terror and the fierce determination to remain human in an inhuman world. When I open this door, Zofia whispered, each word precise and urgent, you run. The window, into the courtyard, through the gap in the wall we talked about. Don't stop. Don't look back. Get to your families. Scatter. We can't leave you. Jakub started, but Zofia cut him off with a look that was pure steel. You will do as I say. This is the last lesson. Run. The door shuddered under another blow. Wood splintered. They were seconds away from breaking through. Zofia made her choice. She threw open the bolt and stepped into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind her with such force that it slammed, buying precious seconds. In the hallway stood 2 Gestapo officers and a Polish auxiliary policeman, a collaborator, his face twisted with the shame of what he'd become. You took your time, one of the Germans said in clipped, precise Polish. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of face that might have been handsome if it weren't arranged in an expression of contempt. His partner was older, heavier, with cold eyes that had seen too much and felt nothing. I was sleeping, Zofia said, her voice steady despite the hurricane in her chest. I'm alone. What do you want? Alone? The young officer smiled. It was not a kind smile. We've had reports of children entering this building, of illegal gatherings. He paused, savoring the word, illegal education. Behind the door, Zofia heard the softest sound, the whisper of the window cloth being moved aside. The children were following her instructions. Good, good. I don't know what you're talking about, Zofia said, taking a step forward, away from the door, drawing the officer's attention to herself. I live alone. I mind my own business. The older officer pushed past her and reached for the door handle. No, Zofia grabbed his arm. An insane thing to do, touching a German officer, but she needed seconds, just a few more seconds. You can't. My papers, they're inside. Let me get them for you. The officer backhanded her casually, the way someone might swat a fly. Zofia felt her lips split, tasted blood, felt herself stumbling backward. But she'd bought time. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. The door swung open. The room was in disarray. The table was still there, the chairs scattered. Papers on the floor, they hadn't had time to hide everything. But the window was open, the cloth fluttering in the November wind. And the children were gone. The older officer crossed to the window in 3 strides, leaned out, scanning the darkened courtyard below. Zofia held her breath, praying to gods she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Please let them be fast. Please let them be silent. Please let them disappear into the darkness like smoke. I see nothing, the officer said finally, turning back. His eyes fell on the papers scattered on the floor. He bent, picked one up. It was Anna's notebook, dropped in the panic. Her handwriting, careful and precise, copying out a Mikovich poem. The temperature in the room dropped. Education materials, the young officer said softly. Illegal teaching. Polish cultural propaganda. He looked at Zofia with something almost like respect. You're braver than you look, teacher. Zofia said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was there, scattered on the floor like accusations. Notebooks, pencils, the tattered atlas still open on the table. Where are the children? The older officer demanded. What children? Zofia's voice was steady, defiant even. If she was going to die, and she knew she would die protecting them. I teach myself. I study alone. It's not illegal to own books in your own home. The young officer laughed. We'll see what you say at headquarters. Bring her. The collaborator stepped forward, his face carefully blank. As he moved to grab Zofia's arm, their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. And in that moment, Zofia saw something flicker in his expression. Regret? Shame? Or was it something else, a warning? He gripped her arm, but not roughly. As he led her toward the door, he leaned close and whispered in Polish, so quietly the German officers couldn't hear. They made it out. I saw them. All 7. They're safe. Zofia didn't react, didn't let herself feel the overwhelming relief that threatened to buckle her knees. But inside, in the deepest part of herself, something sang with fierce, wild joy. They'd made it. Her students had escaped. Whatever happened to her now, torture, execution, transportation to the camps, it didn't matter. The children were safe. Room 12 had been discovered, but its students survived. As they marched her down the stairs, past frightened faces peering from doorways, Zofia thought about those 7 children somewhere out there in the darkness, running through alleys they'd memorized, using every lesson she'd taught them about survival. They would scatter to their families. They would hide. They would endure. And someday, when this nightmare ended, because it would end, it had to end, they would remember. They would remember Room 12 and the lessons whispered by candlelight. They would remember that once, in the darkest time, a teacher had stood between them and the Gestapo and had bought them the seconds they needed to run. They would remember, and they would teach their own children. And those children would teach their children. The chain would continue, unbroken, a lineage of resistance that no occupation could ever truly crush. The Gestapo could take her. They could close Room 12. They could burn every book in Warsaw. But they couldn't kill what had been planted in the minds of 7 children who'd learned to read and write and think in defiance of every law the Reich had imposed. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered. As they pushed her into the back of a military truck, Zofia allowed herself one last thought of her students. She imagined them safe, hidden, already planning how they would continue learning even without her. Because that was what she'd really taught them. Not just mathematics and poetry and history, but the lesson that learning itself was an act of resistance. That knowledge was freedom. that no one could ever truly enslave a mind that refused to stop thinking. The truck's engine roared to life. Through the canvas covering, Zofia caught one last glimpse of the building that had housed room 12. The window on the third floor was still open, the curtains still fluttering. Like a flag, like a banner of defiance, like hope that refused to die, no matter how hard the boots tried to crush it. The truck lurched forward into the darkness, carrying Zofia toward an uncertain fate. But she was smiling through her split lip and the blood on her chin, because 7 children were running free into the night. And that meant she'd won. Warsaw, January 1945. The city the Red Army liberated barely deserved the name anymore. Where buildings had once stood, there were only mountains of rubble. Where streets had once run, there were now valleys of debris. The systematic destruction of Warsaw after the uprising had been so complete, so thorough, that survivors returning to the city couldn't find their own neighborhoods. The map of memory no longer matched the landscape of ruins. But the people came back anyway. Like streams finding their way to the sea, the survivors trickled in from the forests, from the camps, from whatever hiding places had kept them alive through the long nightmare. They came searching for family, for friends, for any familiar face in the wasteland. In a temporary refugee center set up in the outskirts, for young people found each other. Jakub saw Anna first. She was standing in a food line, so thin he almost didn't recognize her. But there was something in the way she held herself, the tilt of her head, that was unmistakable. He called her name, and when she turned and saw him, they both stood frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe that the other was real. Then they were running toward each other, laughing and crying at the same time, holding each other as if to prove through touch that this wasn't a dream, that they had both somehow survived. Hannah found them hours later, led by rumor. Someone had heard that 2 of the children from room 12 were alive, were looking for others. She limped slightly, a souvenir from a bombing that had nearly killed her in the final months of the war. When she saw Jakub and Anna, she simply collapsed into their arms, sobbing with a grief and relief so profound that no words could contain it. And the next day, Pyotr arrived. No longer the smallest, no longer the child who struggled with reading. He'd grown tall in the intervening years, aged beyond his years by things no one should have to see. But his eyes were still Pyotr's eyes. And when he smiled at them, tentatively, hopefully, they saw the boy they'd known in room 12. 4 out of 7. They waited for the others. They left messages in the refugee centers, spoke to every aid worker, checked every list of survivors that was posted and reposted throughout the ruined city. But Stefan never came. Neither did Tomasz. Neither did Christina. The silence where their names should have been was deafening. Eventually, through fragments of stories pieced together from other survivors, they learned the fates of their missing friends. Stefan had been caught in a random roundup 6 months after the raid on room 12, sent to a labor camp. He died of typhus 3 weeks before liberation. Tomasz and Christina, the inseparable siblings, had been killed during the Warsaw Uprising, caught in crossfire while carrying messages for the resistance. They'd been 16 and 14. The 4 survivors sat together in what remained of a city park, just a clearing among rubble now, and they wept for the ones who hadn't made it. For their friends, their fellow students, their brothers and sisters in that small room where they'd learned that education was resistance. And they wept for Miss Sophia. They'd searched for her too, desperately. But there was no record, no trace. The Gestapo headquarters had been destroyed in the uprising, its files scattered or burned. No one knew what had happened to the teacher who'd stood in that doorway and bought them the seconds they needed to escape. She saved us, Anna said quietly, her voice rough with unshed tears. She knew what would happen to her, and she did it anyway. Jakub nodded, unable to speak. We have to remember, Hannah said finally. All of them. We have to carry them forward. It's what she would have wanted. Over the years that followed, as Poland rebuilt itself from the ashes, the 4 survivors of room 12 stayed connected. They helped each other through the trauma, through the nightmares, through the survivors' guilt that came with being the ones who'd lived when so many hadn't. Jakub became an engineer, just as his mother had dreamed. He named his first daughter Zofia. When people asked why, he would tell them about a teacher who'd taught him that learning was an act of rebellion. That knowledge was the one thing no occupier could ever truly steal. Anna became a librarian, surrounding herself with the books that had once been forbidden. She specialized in preserving Polish literature, in making sure that the poems and stories they'd whispered in room 12 would be available to every child who wanted to read them. On the anniversary of the liberation each year, she would recite from memory the Mickiewicz verses Miss Zofia had taught them. Hannah became a teacher herself. In her classroom in rebuilt Warsaw, she would sometimes tell her students about the secret schools of the occupation, about the teachers and children who'd risked everything for education. She never mentioned that she'd been one of those children. That part was too painful, too personal. But she taught with the same fierce determination Miss Zofia had shown, the same belief that education was sacred, that learning was freedom. Pyotr, who'd struggled so much with reading in room 12, became a historian. He devoted his career to documenting the stories of the occupation, making sure that the small acts of resistance, the hidden schools, the underground newspapers, the ordinary people who'd done extraordinary things, would not be forgotten. He interviewed hundreds of survivors, recording their testimonies, preserving their memories. And every time he interviewed someone who'd been part of the secret teaching movement, he thought of Miss Zofia. Decades passed. The 4 survivors grew old. They had children and grandchildren, built lives in a Poland that was free again, scarred but enduring. But they never forgot room 12. In 1985, 40 years after liberation, the 4 of them returned to the building where room 12 had been. It had been rebuilt, modernized, unrecognizable. But they stood in front of it anyway, for elderly people staring at a doorway that meant nothing to the people passing by, but meant everything to them. Do you think she knew? Anna asked quietly. Miss Zofia, do you think she knew we'd make it? That it would matter? She knew, Jakub said with certainty. She knew because she taught us that it would. That we would carry forward what we'd learned. That we would matter. Hannah placed a small bouquet of flowers by the door. No plaque, no memorial, just flowers for a teacher whose name appeared on no official records, who'd vanished into the machinery of the occupation and left behind only memories. Thank you, Pyotr whispered to the building, to the ghost of a room that had once been their whole world. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for showing us that some things are worth dying for. They stood there for a long time, for survivors remembering 7 children and 1 teacher in a room lit by a single candle. Remembering lessons whispered in defiance of every law. Remembering the moment when their teacher had stood between them and death and had chosen, without hesitation, to sacrifice herself so they could run. The world moved on around them. Cars passing, people hurrying to work, the ordinary rhythms of a city that had risen from its own ashes. But for those 4, in that moment, time bent backward. They were 12 and 10 and 8 again, sitting shoulder to shoulder at a scarred wooden table, learning that education was an act of resistance, that knowledge was power, that hope could survive anything if you held on to it tightly enough. When they finally turned to leave, Anna looked back one last time. We carried it forward, she said softly. Everything you taught us, Miss Zofia. We carried it forward. And perhaps, in some way that transcended time and death and the vast darkness of history, Zofia Nowak heard her. Perhaps she knew that her 7 children, even the 3 who hadn't survived to see liberation, had mattered. That room 12 had mattered. That every whispered lesson, every moment of terror, every act of defiance had planted seeds that grew into trees, that those trees had scattered seeds of their own, that the forest they'd begun would continue growing long after they were all gone. For survivors walked away from that building, carrying with them the memory of a teacher who'd stood in a doorway and said, without words but with every fiber of her being, you are worth saving. Your education is worth dying for. Run. And they had run. And they had survived. And they had remembered. In the end, that was the greatest lesson Miss Zofia had ever taught them. That memory itself is a form of resistance. That bearing witness is an act of love. That as long as someone remembers, nothing is truly lost. The 7 children of room 12 had learned to read and write and think in defiance of an empire. 3 of them died too young, their potential stolen by war. 4 of them lived long enough to have children and grandchildren, to rebuild, to teach others what they'd learned in that small room lit by a single candle. And through them, through their children and their students and everyone they touched, Miss Zofia's final lesson echoed forward through time. That knowledge is freedom, that learning is resistance, and that hope, fragile, precious, indestructible hope, can survive anything if brave people are willing to protect it, even at the cost of everything, especially at the cost of everything. Today, if you walk through the streets of Warsaw, you'll see a city reborn. Glass towers reach toward the sky. Cafes overflow with students bent over laptops and textbooks. Children run through parks, their laughter echoing off buildings that stand where rubble once lay. The city has been rebuilt, brick by brick, dream by dream, memory by memory. But if you know where to look, if you know what to look for, you can still see the ghosts. There's a small plaque on a building in the Mokoto district. Most people walk past it without noticing. It's just one of hundreds scattered throughout the city, marking places where something significant happened during the occupation. This particular plaque commemorates the Tajin Completi, the secret teaching. It lists no names. It tells no specific stories. Just a simple inscription. Here, education was an act of resistance. The building behind that plaque has been renovated many times since 1942. The apartments have different tenants now. The hallways have been repainted, the stairs replaced, the windows upgraded. There is no room 12 anymore. Just modern flats with modern families living modern lives. But the story remains. Because what happened in that small room wasn't unique. It was extraordinary, yes, but it wasn't singular. All across occupied Poland, in thousands of hidden rooms and secret attics and concealed basements, teachers and students were doing the same thing. Risking everything. Choosing learning over safety. Choosing knowledge over survival. By the war's end, it's estimated that over 1 million Polish students had participated in the secret teaching system. 1 million young minds that the occupation tried to leave barren, that brave teachers refused to abandon. Thousands of those teachers were caught. Thousands were executed. Their names appear in archives and memorial books, but many more left no record at all. They simply vanished into the machinery of oppression, their sacrifice known only to the students they'd saved. Miss Sophia was one of thousands. Her 7 children were 7 among hundreds of thousands. And yet, their story matters. Not because it was unique, but precisely because it wasn't. Because it represents something profound about the human capacity for resistance, for hope, for choosing what's right even when the cost is unthinkable. In 2019, researchers at the University of Warsaw launched a project to document as many stories of the Tajin Completi as they could find. They interviewed the last surviving students and teachers, now in their 80s and 90s. They collected photographs, diaries, lesson plans written on scraps of paper that had somehow survived the decades. They mapped the locations of secret schools throughout the city. What they discovered was astonishing. The secret education system had been vast, sophisticated, organized with the precision of a military operation. There were underground universities offering advanced degrees, secret high schools with full curricula, elementary schools hidden in the most unlikely places, behind bakeries, beneath churches, in the attics of bombed-out buildings. The Nazis had believed they could control a people by controlling what they knew. They believed that education was simply information transfer, that if you stopped the flow of information, you stopped the growth of minds. They were wrong, because education is not just about facts and figures. It's about teaching people how to think, how to question, how to imagine a world different from the one they're living in. And once you've taught someone to think, to truly think, you can never unteach them. That knowledge becomes part of who they are. It spreads, like ripples in water, touching everything they do, everyone they meet, every choice they make. The children who studied in rooms like Room 12 grew up to rebuild Poland. They became the teachers and doctors and engineers and artists of the post-war generation. They raised children and told them stories about what their grandparents had endured. They instilled in those children a deep, almost sacred reverence for education, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself, as a fundamental human right that must be protected at all costs. That legacy echoes forward even now. In modern Poland, there's a tradition called the first bell, the ceremonial ringing of a bell on the first day of school each year. In many schools, before that bell rings, teachers tell their students about the Tajin Completi. They tell them about children their age who risked their lives just to learn, who studied by candlelight in hidden rooms, who memorized lessons because writing them down was too dangerous, who understood, even at 8 or 10 or 12 years old, that education was worth dying for. It's a powerful lesson for young people growing up in a world of compulsory schooling and ubiquitous information. A world where education is sometimes taken for granted, where students might complain about homework or tests without fully appreciating the privilege of having access to learning at all. The story of Room 12, and the thousands of rooms like it, reminds us that education is not inevitable, that the right to learn, to think, to grow intellectually, is something that must be defended, sometimes with laws and policies, sometimes with advocacy and activism, and sometimes, in the darkest moments, with courage and sacrifice. But the legacy of Miss Sophia and her students extends beyond Poland, beyond World War II, beyond any single time or place. Because throughout history, in every society that has tried to suppress learning, there have been people who resisted, who taught in secret, who preserved knowledge against all odds. In Afghanistan today, there are girls learning to read in hidden schools, defying regimes that forbid female education. In North Korea, there are people secretly accessing forbidden information, risking their lives to learn about the world beyond their borders. In countless places across the globe, education remains an act of resistance, a declaration of human dignity in the face of oppression. The light that flickered in Room 12 in 1942 is still burning. It burns in every classroom where teachers nurture curiosity instead of crushing it, in every library that makes knowledge accessible to all, in every parent who reads to their child and opens up worlds of possibility, in every student who asks why and refuses to accept easy answers. That light is fragile. It must be tended, protected, defended, but it is also inextinguishable, because the human drive to learn, to grow, to understand, that drive is as fundamental as the drive to breathe. You can suppress it. You can punish it. You can build entire systems designed to extinguish it. But you cannot kill it. Not completely. Not ever. Miss Sophia understood this. She understood that by teaching 7 children, she was doing more than passing on information about mathematics and poetry and history. She was passing on something infinitely more valuable, the understanding that knowledge itself is an act of freedom. That learning is a form of resistance. That education is not just about preparing for the future. It is about claiming your humanity in the present. When she stood in that doorway and faced the Gestapo, when she bought her students those precious seconds to escape, she was making a statement that echoes across the decades. These children matter. Their minds matter. Their right to learn matters more than my life. And she was right, because Jakob grew up to be an engineer who helped rebuild his country. Anna became a guardian of literature, preserving the cultural heritage that the occupation had tried to erase. Hannah became a teacher who passed on the lessons she'd learned in Room 12 to a new generation. Pyotr became a historian who made sure the stories of resistance would never be forgotten. 3 of their classmates didn't survive to see liberation. Stefan, Tomasz, and Christina died too young, their futures stolen by war. But even they mattered. Even they left ripples. Because the 4 who survived carried their memory forward, told their stories, made sure they were more than just names on a list of the dead. That's the final lesson of Room 12, that every person matters. Every mind is worth defending. Every student deserves a teacher willing to stand between them and darkness. And when we educate a child, anywhere, we're not just filling their head with facts. We're giving them the tools to imagine a better world. And imagination, as it turns out, is the most powerful weapon against tyranny ever invented. So yes, Miss Sophia taught 7 children in a hidden room in occupied Warsaw. But through them, she taught thousands. Tens of thousands. Everyone they touched, everyone who heard their stories, everyone who learned from their example. And now, through this story, she teaches us. She teaches us that education is never just education. It's an act of hope, a declaration of faith in the future, a refusal to surrender to darkness. She teaches us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, principle over safety. She teaches us that the light of knowledge, once lit, can never be fully extinguished, no matter how hard the winds of tyranny blow. In the ruins of Warsaw, 1 woman taught 7 children. And the world learned that even under tyranny, even in the darkest night, the human spirit refuses to stop teaching, refuses to stop learning, refuses to surrender its right to grow and think and hope. That lesson, that precious, powerful lesson, is Miss Sophia's true legacy. And it's a legacy that belongs to all of us now. To protect, to honor, to carry forward. One room, 7 children, one teacher, and a light that still burns, all these decades later, showing us the way through darkness toward a future where every child, everywhere, has the right to learn. Not because it's convenient, not because it's safe, but because it's human, because it's right. Because education, real education, the kind that teaches you to think and question and imagine, is the foundation of freedom itself. Remember room 12. Remember its children. Remember its teacher. And then carry that memory forward into whatever darkness you face, as a reminder that knowledge is power, learning is resistance, and hope, fragile, precious, indestructible hope, can survive anything as long as brave people are willing to protect it, even at the cost of everything, especially at the cost of everything.